My name is Emily Clark, and I was 11 when the world ended twice. Once when my parents died, and again when the state told me no one wanted me. Years later, when I finally found love, I thought I was free of that ache. But my future mother-in-law looked me dead in the eye and said, "A girl with no family has no place marrying into ours." And then my fiancé walked into the room, and what he said made me cry. Before we dive into this story, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you've ever felt like the odd one out in a room full of people who think they're better than you, this story is for you. The social worker's office smelled like lemon-scented cleaner and something else I couldn't name. Something hollow and clinical, like paper and endings. I was 11. My sneakers didn't touch the floor when I sat in that too-tall chair, and the way Ms. Dawkins kept glancing at the clock made me feel like a burden she was trying to clear off her desk. "I'm not going," I said. My voice didn't shake, though my throat burned like I'd swallowed fire. My parents had died 3 weeks ago in a car crash off I-79, and after bouncing between 2 distant cousins who returned me like I was a wrong order, this was the next stop, an orphanage. The word made my stomach twist. "I'm not going," I repeated, louder this time. "You can't make me." Ms. Dawkins folded her hands over a manila folder labeled Clark Emily. She had kind eyes, but the kind that were tired, worn down by too many kids who wanted what she couldn't give. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "we've called everyone, no one is coming." That did it. Tears rose without warning, hot and angry. I hated crying in front of people, but they came anyway. My fists clenched in my lap, nails digging into my palms hard enough to leave half-moons. "They said no," Ms. Dawkins added quietly. "Your mother's cousin in Ohio has 4 children already, and your father's sister in Florida, she says she's not in a position to take you in. I'm so sorry, Emily." I turned to the window. Outside, downtown Pittsburgh was gray and unmoved. Buses wheezed past. People walked with their heads down, wrapped in coats and burdens. I watched them because looking at Ms. Dawkins felt too final. It was like my life had been a house and someone had kicked in all the walls and now expected me to live there, shivering. "I don't want to go," I whispered. "I know," she said. "I wouldn't either." Silence filled the room, thick as grief. Then she added, like it might soften the blow, "You're strong. The way you've held yourself together, it's rare. Most kids wouldn't be able to, but I didn't want to be strong. I wanted to be wanted." And in that moment, looking out the window at a city that didn't even know my name, I made a vow. One day I'll never need anyone again. I'll build my life from scratch, and I'll make it so full of purpose, people will wonder how an orphan girl managed it. They'll wish they hadn't looked away. Years passed, but that cold, echoing promise I made in the social worker's office never faded. If anything, it hardened into the backbone of my life. By 21, I was juggling the night shift at Dot's Diner in downtown Pittsburgh while studying social sciences at Allegheny Community College. My tiny apartment sat over a closed-down barber shop on Ellsworth Avenue. It always smelled like old linoleum and burned coffee, no matter how many candles I lit, but it was mine. The first key that belonged only to me. My closet was half Goodwill, half clearance rack. My kitchen shelf was more ramen than recipe. Taped to the inside of the cabinet door above my sink was a list titled, "No one is saving YOU." Geo, get it? Below were 3 goals. Earn my degree, find real love, build a life no one can take from me. Some nights, between late homework and back-to-back shifts, I would stare at that list until my eyes blurred. And then one Tuesday night, somewhere between wiping down counter 6 and refilling coffee for the 3rd time, he walked in. Michael was the kind of quiet that made people lean in. Tall, dark-haired, with those tired but kind eyes, like he'd seen enough of the world to stop trying to impress it. He slid into a booth near the window, ordered just coffee and a grilled cheese, and said thank you like he meant it. The first time I barely noticed him, but he came back, again, and again. Always on Tuesdays, always right around 9:30 like clockwork. "You planning to rent that booth permanently?" I teased one night, balancing a pot of fresh decaf. Smiled, just the corners of his mouth like he didn't overuse it. "Depends, you charging by the hour or the company?" I blinked. A law student with a sense of humor, rare breed. He told me his name that night, Michael Rowan. 3rd year at Pitt Law, said he liked the diner because it was untouched by ambition, which I found both hilarious and slightly offensive. "Ambition's what keeps this place open," I shot back. "You think people work graveyard shifts for fun? His eyes softened. Fair point. From that night on, our banter became routine. He'd quiz himself with flashcards at the counter, and I'd toss in questions like, which Supreme Court case made it illegal to talk about yourself in the third person for too long? He'd answer with something fake and elaborate, and we'd both laugh quietly, like we were sharing a secret in a world too loud to listen. One night close to Christmas, he noticed the small book I'd wedged under the register, The Sociology of Marginalization, marked with post-its and underlines. He held it up, brows raised. Social sciences, I nodded, suddenly self-conscious. Yeah, not glamorous, but I want to work with kids like I was. His face changed, not in pity, but something else. Respect, maybe, or understanding. That's not unglamorous, he said, handing it back carefully. That's the most important work there is. My throat caught. It was a small sentence, but no one had ever said anything like that to me before. Not with conviction, not with that kind of quiet reverence. From that night, something shifted. He stayed later, asked more questions, talked less about law school stress and more about growing up in a family where expectations were so loud, they drowned out desire. I shared pieces of my story too, carefully at first, like peeling a sticker you're afraid might tear. My parents died when I was 11, I told him once, while we split a leftover slice of pie at the back table. No one took me in. I went to a place called Oakbridge Home. It wasn't awful, but it was human either. He didn't interrupt, just listened, quiet still, like he knew sometimes the biggest comfort was being heard, not fixed. I found myself looking forward to Tuesdays in a way I hadn't looked forward to anything in years. His presence steadied something in me I didn't know was shaking. The apartment still had creaky pipes and the occasional mouse. My textbook pile grew taller than my fridge. But now, when I walked in at 3 a.m., heels sore and hair smelling like bacon grease, I'd find myself smiling. Because in the midst of all that noise and effort, Michael had become a soft place to land. And for the first time since I was a scared girl staring out that social worker's window, I wasn't just surviving. I was starting to believe I might get all three things on that list. It didn't happen all at once. Love rarely does. It crept in the way sunlight crawls across a hardwood floor, quiet, inevitable, warm before you notice it. Michael and I never had an official first date. It was more like a series of Tuesday nights that blurred into early Wednesday mornings. A coffee here, a walk after my shift there, conversations that slipped from lighthearted jokes to confessions neither of us meant to say out loud. One night, after a late study session in the diner's back booth, he walked me home. My apartment building looked even sadder under the yellow street lamp, but he didn't flinch. "You live here alone?" he asked, standing at the foot of the steps. "Yeah, for 4 years now," I said, unlocking the glass door with my key that stuck if you didn't angle it just right. "I've moved 3 times in the same building, upgraded to a unit with actual heating." He smiled, but I caught the way his eyes lingered on the peeling paint of the doorway. Still, he didn't offer to save me. That's how I knew he was different. Some men see my story as a problem to fix. Michael saw it as something sacred, an origin, not a flaw. I didn't invite him up that night. We weren't that kind of rushed. But we stood outside for a while, neither of us saying goodbye. Weeks later, he finally kissed me in the alley behind the diner. I just pulled off my apron and was griping about a customer who left me 73 cents on a $40 check. He laughed, reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear, and said, "I think you're the strongest person I've ever met." Then he leaned in. There were no fireworks, no swelling soundtrack, just the steady press of his lips and the way his hands trembled slightly at my waist, like he knew this mattered. And it did. We became an us in the kind of slow burn way that builds real fire. By spring, I was spending most nights at his off-campus apartment, a 5th-floor walk-up with a view of the river if you stood on the coffee table and craned your neck. The place was barely larger than my own, but it felt different. Warmer. Safer. One night, after we pushed 2 thrift store bookshelves against the wall, Michael turned to me and said, "It's weird, but this already feels like home." I knew exactly what he meant. We made dinner together on Sundays, always cheap meals, always with music playing in the background. Our favorites became pasta with jarred sauce and grilled cheese with tomato soup. He called it grad school gourmet. I called it better than alone. His apartment slowly became ours. My toothbrush in the bathroom, my socks in his drawer. One corner of his bookshelf devoted to my textbooks and charity shop poetry collections. We never talked about moving in. It just happened, quietly, like us. There were moments, small ones, when I caught myself watching him fold laundry or highlight his textbooks and thought, this is what safe looks like. It wasn't the grand gestures. It was the ordinary moments made extraordinary by the fact that no one had ever given me a space to breathe before. Michael wasn't perfect. He could be moody when stressed and had a habit of muttering legal terms in his sleep. But when he wrapped his arms around me after a long shift and murmured, "You're my peace," I believed him, because he was mine too. One night, curled up on the couch after a thunderstorm knocked out the power, we played 20 questions in the dark. His hand traced circles on my thigh as he asked, "If you could go anywhere, no money issues, no past, just a clean slate, where would you go?" I didn't even have to think. "Somewhere I'm not constantly proving I belong." He was quiet for a beat. Then he whispered, "You always belong with me." The tears came so fast I barely had time to blink them back. Not because I didn't believe him, but because for the first time in my life, someone else did. I told him more about my childhood after that. Not all at once. Pieces. Like how the staff at Oakbridge changed every few months and I learned not to get attached. How birthdays were marked with group cupcakes and a list of names called out in alphabetical order. How I stopped asking why me by the time I was 12 and started asking, what now? Michael never recoiled. He never said, "I can't imagine." He didn't need to. He just held my hand tighter and said, "You deserve everything you're working for." And somehow, hearing that from him made me believe it. Our world became this little ecosystem, two people, one shared future blooming in a dingy apartment lit by fairy lights and microwave glow. We talked about dreams often. He wanted to work in public interest law, maybe help kids like I once was. I wanted to finish school, get my MSW, maybe even start a nonprofit one day. The future didn't scare me. Not anymore. Because for the first time, I wasn't running from loneliness. I was running towards something. Or maybe someone. It was a Saturday in early October. The kind of day where the sky looks like a washed-out watercolor and the wind carries just enough bite to remind you summer's gone. Michael had asked if I wanted to take a walk by the river. No books, no to-do lists. Just us and the leaves. We brought coffee in mismatched thermoses, his with a chipped handle, mine with a faded sticker that said, "Ask me about social justice." The path along the Allegheny was littered with crisp leaves that crunched under our boots. People passed with strollers and headphones. The world felt quiet in a good way. We found an empty bench tucked behind a stretch of willows, half hidden from the path. Michael sat beside me, stretching his legs out long in front of him. "I've been meaning to tell you something," he said, not looking at me. That phrase, so innocent, so familiar, landed like a rock in my stomach. I tucked my hands under my thighs to keep them from fidgeting. "Okay," he took a breath. "My family's from Philadelphia, Chestnut Hill. My parents live there, so do my grandparents. They're old money." I blinked. Not because I didn't understand what that meant, but because I did. Instantly. That explained the watch he never bragged about but always wore. The occasional references to boarding schools and summering in Maine. I just assumed he was from a comfortable family, not the kind whose names showed up in society pages. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Like, how old are we talking?" He laughed, but it was a nervous one. "Great-grandfather founded a bank, family estate, legacy stuff. Think silver spoons and expectations with strings attached." I stared out at the water, my pulse starting to quicken. That quiet rhythm in my chest, the one I'd finally calmed after all those years of being the girl with no people, began to stir again. "And they know about me?" I asked. Michael hesitated. "Not yet." My breath caught. He must have felt it because he reached for my hand. "Not because I'm ashamed. Never that. I needed to be sure, before I introduced you to a world I've spent years trying to untangle myself from." I didn't speak. Couldn't, because the moment he said old money, my entire body went cold with a memory I thought I'd buried. Oakbridge home. Age 13. Sitting on a twin bed in donated pajamas 2 sizes too big while watching a soap opera on a shared TV. The main character had been mocked at a fancy dinner party for not knowing which fork to use. Everyone laughed. I laughed too, until I realized it felt familiar. That fork moment? That's what Michael was asking me to walk into. "I don't belong in that world," I whispered, eyes still on the river. He squeezed my hand. "Emily, you belong wherever you decide you do, not where some last name hierarchy says you should." But the fear was rising anyway, thick, familiar, unwelcome. I'd built so much of my life on being composed, capable, invisible if necessary. That world he came from, it devoured girls like me, girls who had no linens to inherit, no family crest, no story that fit on a holiday card. I don't have people, I said, swallowing hard. No parents, no connections, not even a godmother to write me a recommendation. I was a number in a system for most of my childhood. Michael's eyes darkened, not with pity, but with something else. Defensiveness, shame. I know, and I love you for who you are, not in spite of that. That word, love, hit different when spoken in the same breath as a confession. But still, I had to ask. What if they don't see it that way? He didn't answer right away. The leaves around us rustled, sending a few tumbling to the ground like little surrender flags. His silence said everything. I turned to him slowly. You think they won't like me? I think, he stopped, running a hand through his hair. They're used to a certain kind of daughter-in-law. Ivy League, comes from a good family. And I'm a girl who grew up in hand-me-downs and aged out foster homes. His jaw tightened. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. The bench suddenly felt cold beneath me. I stood up, wrapping my coat tighter, the wind finding its way through all my layers. He stood too, reaching for me, but I stepped back, not out of anger, just out of self-preservation. I can't change where I come from, Michael. I would never ask you to. But you also haven't told them I exist. He winced. That's why I wanted to talk now. I'm ready, but I need you to know what we're walking into. I turned my eyes back to the river, water dark and moving fast. Will they hate me? I asked quietly. No, he said. But they'll judge you. He said it with such certainty, like it was a fact of the world, gravity, time, prejudice. And suddenly, all the years I spent building myself up from nothing felt fragile. Could love survive in a house that had never known need? I didn't have the answer. But as Michael reached for my hand again and laced his fingers through mine, I realized something surprising. I still wanted to try. When Michael opened the iron gate to his parents' estate, my breath caught. It wasn't just a house. It was a monument. The kind with pillars you see in historical films, with brick chimneys tall enough to cast shadows across the entire front lawn. Perfectly trimmed hedges lined the driveway like guards. Even the trees seemed bred for money, ancient, expensive, dignified. His parents lived in a mansion just outside Philadelphia's main line. I'd Googled the zip code the night before. Median household income, $400,000. The air here smelled like old wood, fireplace smoke, and something else I couldn't place. Expectation. Michael reached for my hand as we stepped onto the wraparound porch. It's going to be fine. I nodded, but my palms were already damp. I wore my best outfit, a navy blue dress I'd scored at a thrift shop and had tailored for a job interview. My makeup was careful, understated. My curls pulled back in a bun so tight it ached a little. The door swung open before we knocked. A tall woman in a pearl gray sweater and diamond earrings stood in the doorway. Her face didn't move, no smile, no frown, just a polite, neutral shield. Emily, this is my mother, Michael said too brightly. Margaret. She extended her hand, cold, delicate, as if touching too firmly might tarnish her rings. Emily, she said, so glad you could come. I smiled. Thank you for having me, Mrs. Rowan. She stepped aside without answering, and we were ushered into a sitting room that looked like something from a museum. Cream velvet chairs, oil paintings, a piano no one had played in years. The air was still, controlled, as if even the furniture knew not to speak too loud. His father, Charles, joined us moments later, gray-haired, tall, with an old-school Wall Street voice that made even hello sound like an investment pitch. We sat. I folded my hands in my lap and answered their questions the way I'd prepped all week. Polite, short, neutral. Where did I grow up? Pittsburgh. Where did I go to school? Allegheny Community College. What did I study? Social sciences. What did I plan to do with that? I want to work with foster youth, help them navigate the system and advocate for themselves. Margaret sipped her wine slowly. Ah, that was it, just like a taste she didn't care for. Michael tried to keep the mood light, making jokes about how terrible he was at cooking, about my flashcard interrogation skills when he studied for the bar. But the warmth fell flat. It was like trying to roast marshmallows over ice cubes. At one point, Charles leaned forward. Emily, you mentioned foster work. Do you come from a background in the system? Michael glanced sharply at him, but I nodded calmly. I grew up in care after my parents passed away. I aged out at 18. Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't have to. Her eyes told the story. Pity, then suspicion, then polite detachment. "Oh," she said, "that must have been formative." I kept my expression steady. "It was, that's why I want to help others through it." More ahs, more sips. The wine clinked in crystal. The silverware sparkled even though no one touched the hors d'oeuvres. The entire room felt like a courtroom where I was the defendant and my life story was Exhibit A. The coded questions came next. "What do your holidays typically look like, Emily?" Translation: "Who do you spend them with since you have no family?" "What's your last name from originally?" "Clark." "English." Translation: "Can we trace you to something respectable?" Every answer I gave felt like walking a tightrope between dignity and defense. At one point, Margaret looked at me, head slightly tilted. "You must be very resilient." I smiled, though my throat tightened. "I've had practice." Michael reached for my hand under the table, gripped it like a lifeline. After an hour of this silent performance, Margaret stood. "Well," she said, "dinner is being served." In the dining room, I was seated directly across from her like she wanted a front row seat to whatever spectacle she imagined I might become. She gestured to the antique silver napkin rings. "These have been in the family since the 1800s. I nodded. "They're beautiful." She smiled, faint but sharp. "They've seen many generations at this table, marriages, christenings, important celebrations." I knew what she meant. This table was built for legacy, and I wasn't it. The food was exquisite: roast duck, wild rice, asparagus spears with lemon butter. I barely tasted a thing. Conversation turned to wedding plans. Margaret asked, "Will your side of the family be joining us for the ceremony?" Michael began to answer, but I cut in softly. "There's no one to invite from my side." The silence that followed was so thick, I could have drowned in it. Margaret gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Ah!" I'd lost count of how many ahs I'd collected that evening. 1,000 unsaid judgments wrapped in one syllable. By the end of the night, my jaw ached from smiling. As we walked out, Margaret kissed Michael's cheek lightly, then turned to me. "It was enlightening to meet you, Emily. I'm sure we'll speak again soon." I nodded. "Thank you again for having me." The front door closed with a soft click. As we drove away, Michael didn't say anything. Neither did I, but in the reflection of the car window, I caught my own expression, and it wasn't fear. Not entirely. It was recognition. I'd been underestimated before, dismissed before. But this time, something else bloomed inside me. Resolve. When we got back to the apartment, I sat on the edge of the couch like I wasn't sure I was allowed to exhale. Michael dropped his keys in the dish by the door, loosened his collar, and sighed the way people do when a day has squeezed them dry. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked. I shook my head slowly. "I'm not sure where to start." He came and sat next to me, thigh to thigh, silent but present, the way he always was when he sensed I needed time. But my silence was deceptive tonight. Beneath it swirled a current I couldn't name, not quite anger, not quite grief, something in between. "I felt like I was on trial," I said finally. "Like I had to explain why I deserved to be loved." Michael leaned forward, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm sorry, I should have prepared you better. My parents, they're very practiced at being polite while making people feel small." I nodded, my lips pressed together. "And I'm sure I'll get a follow-up email in a day or two about your composure under pressure, and how you must be very grateful." His voice dripped with sarcasm, but I knew it was guilt underneath. "You don't have to defend me to them," I said quietly. He turned to me, surprised. "I want to defend you." "I know," I said, pausing. "But I need to know I can stand there without needing to be rescued. Because if this is going to be our life, if I'm going to be the girl with no pedigree sitting at their holiday table, I can't keep folding myself up to fit." Michael took my hand, tracing small circles against my palm. "I meant it when I said I'd stand by you. But you don't have to prove anything, Emily. Not to them. Not to anyone." I nodded, but it didn't erase the echo of Margaret's voice in my head. "Will your side of the family be joining us for the ceremony?" The question that sounded like a statement. "You bring nothing to the table." I looked around our apartment, our sanctuary, the half-burnt vanilla candle, the thrift store lamp draped in a scarf that gave everything a golden glow. Our books stacked sideways because we hadn't bought shelves yet. The life we were building here was small, imperfect, and completely ours. And it felt like the opposite of everything I'd walked into earlier that evening. "We don't need their approval to get married," Michael said, watching me. "No," I agreed. "But it would be nice if your wedding didn't feel like a rebellion." That made him laugh, soft and bitter. "Everything I do is a rebellion to them. Choosing law over investment banking. Living here instead of the Rowan townhouse. Dating you just makes the revolution personal. I raised an eyebrow. Glad to know I'm a political statement now. He winced. Sorry, that came out wrong. But it hadn't, not really, that was the problem. Loving me came with context, and his family saw me as a threat to a carefully curated narrative, a woman shaped by circumstance, not legacy. Michael wrapped his arms around me and pulled me against his chest. They'll come around, he said into my hair. Eventually. I didn't say anything, because what if they did? What if every anniversary, every holiday, every milestone came with a fresh reminder that I'd married into a family that would always view me as an outlier? I didn't want to think about it. So instead, I buried myself deeper into his chest and let the tension seep out of my shoulders. You still want to marry me, right? I asked after a beat. His arms tightened. You kidding? I'd marry you in a Taco Bell parking lot tomorrow if you asked. I laughed through my nose. Tempting. Let's not let their opinions weigh more than our reality, he whispered. Let's make this wedding about us. I nodded slowly. Okay. But I also knew it wasn't just a wedding, it was a statement, a test. A collision between the life I'd fought to build and the world he came from. Later that night, while jazz crackled from the tiny Bluetooth speaker and I sat at the table making a rough draft of our guest list, I caught Michael watching me. What? I asked, looking up. He smiled, slow and soft. Nothing. You just look like the rest of my life. And for a moment, the sting of that dinner faded. Because in here, in this space we'd built with late nights and second-hand furniture, I was enough. If the dinner had been an interrogation, the wedding planning was a Cold War. At first, I thought maybe I'd misread Margaret Rowan. Maybe she was just formal, or slow to warm. Maybe that quiet, stony gaze was just her version of processing new things, like her son marrying a girl who came from nothing. But it was. It was resistance. Strategically polite, immaculately dressed resistance. Michael and I set up a Zoom call with both families to talk venues. I'd made a small slideshow with ideas, places with character but within our modest budget, a botanical garden in the city, a library with arched ceilings and warm brick. I even included a barn-turned-event space just outside Pittsburgh, surrounded by tall grass and fairy lights. Margaret smiled through all of them, the kind of smile that doesn't touch your eyes. Lovely, she said. Very cozy. She said cozy the way one might describe a motel off the freeway, or soup served lukewarm. Michael's father Charles added a brief, uninterested then returned to scrolling through something off camera. Of course, Margaret continued, the Rowan Club has hosted weddings for generations. Michael's cousin Brianna was married there just last year. Beautiful ceremony. The wine cellar makes a lovely photo backdrop. I nodded, holding my breath. We hadn't even made it past the slideshow title before she started talking about legacy. Actually, Michael said, we're looking for something a little more us. Margaret blinked. Of course, I just assumed you'd want to maintain tradition. Michael reached over and rested a hand on my leg, giving it a squeeze. We are, he said, our tradition. The call ended soon after, but that was only the beginning. From there, it was small things, repeated enough to become not so small. The florist I loved wasn't used to large-scale events. The bakery I'd picked specialized in casual cakes. When I sent her 3 dress designs I liked, she replied, Do you think lace might be a bit fragile on you? I stared at the email for 10 minutes before realizing what she meant. Fragile. As if something soft didn't belong on someone with a hard past. I never told Michael. Not then. What was the point? He already knew she was difficult. He already believed in me. Saying it aloud would only give her words more power. So instead, I gritted my teeth and smiled through our next phone meeting, listening as she gently suggested a planner she'd worked with before, just to help keep things elevated. I said I'd think about it, then deleted the email. At home, things were still sweet. Michael would come home with surprise takeout or sneak behind me in the kitchen just to kiss my shoulder and tell me I was doing amazing. We'd spend late nights folding origami place cards because I couldn't afford custom calligraphy. He loved those nights, paper cranes littering the table, jazz humming from the speakers, our laughter overlapping with scissors snipping. Our wedding was becoming a story, not the glossy kind you see in bridal magazines, but one made from glue sticks and heart. Still, I couldn't ignore how every call with his mother left me with a tight throat and a hollow chest. One afternoon, after a florist appointment I had to attend alone, Margaret cornered me in the tea room of the Rowan Club. I had stopped by briefly to pick up Michael, who was meeting his father for lunch. I didn't expect to see her there. Alone. She was drinking chamomile, of course, her posture perfect. "I'm glad you dropped in," she said. I smiled politely. "It was just a quick stop." She gestured to the seat across from her. "Sit for a moment. I'd love to hear more about your ideas." That was a lie. She didn't want to hear my ideas. She wanted to assess them, but I sat. Because that's what you do when someone has power over something you care about, even if it's just implied. We talked centerpieces, linens, invitations, and then she leaned forward and said it. "Emily, I know this must all feel a bit overwhelming." I blinked. "Not really, it's exciting." She offered another faint smile. "Of course, but I imagine it's quite a contrast from what you're used to." There it was. The suggestion that I was in over my head, that I was a visitor in this world, trying on elegance like an ill-fitting coat. I looked her in the eye and said, "Every part of this wedding feels like a celebration of how far I've come, not a contrast, a continuation." Her smile thinned. I finished my tea and left. That night, I sat with Michael on our couch, folding RSVP cards into small envelopes. He was humming under his breath, off-key and happy. I watched him for a long time, then asked, "Do you ever wish we just eloped?" He glanced up. "Honestly, sometimes. But then I remember how you looked when you saw that garden venue, or how proud you were when we figured out how to make your aunt's old earrings work with the dress." I nodded, staring at the little pile of cards. "I just didn't think it would be so hard trying to celebrate love in a room full of people deciding if you deserve it." Michael set down his pen and took my hand. "Then we don't let them decide." We sat like that in the soft light of our home, in the middle of paper cranes, half-licked envelopes, and a playlist full of love songs we hadn't picked yet. The world outside could question me, but in here, I was never fragile. I was becoming a bride, and not even Margaret Rowan could take that from me. The rehearsal dinner was held in a ballroom with high ceilings and even higher expectations. Margaret had insisted on booking the venue, some exclusive hall adjacent to the Rowan Club with gilded chandeliers and polished floors that echoed every footstep like it was a warning. I'd wanted something smaller, intimate, a room that felt warm, not watchful, but I told myself it didn't matter. Tomorrow I'd be marrying Michael. That was the only thing real in all this curated perfection. He looked stunning that night. Charcoal suit, open collar, eyes only for me. "Just breathe," he whispered as we stood at the edge of the room, greeting relatives I'd never met and acquaintances who smiled at me like I was a charity project they'd been briefed on. I did my best to smile back. The night was full of polite toasts and champagne bubbles. There was laughter, some genuine, some staged. My name came up in every other speech, strong, inspiring, self-made. Every time someone used my story as decoration, I felt my ribs tighten. But nothing prepared me for the moment that came next. After dinner, I slipped upstairs to the bridal suite they'd set aside for me. A lavish room with soft ivory curtains, a tufted chaise lounge, and an oversized mirror I couldn't look into yet. I needed a minute to myself. Just a breath. That's when the door creaked open. Margaret stepped inside like she'd been waiting for her cue. "Lovely evening, isn't it?" she said, glancing around the room like it belonged to her. I turned to face her, my fingers tightening around the edge of the vanity. "Yes," I replied. "It's been a lot." She walked toward the mirror, not looking at me directly. "Tomorrow's a big day." I nodded once. "It is." There was a pause, too long, the kind that says something's coming and it won't be kind. Then she turned to me fully. Her voice was soft, almost gentle. "Emily, I want to speak plainly." That alone should have been my warning. She stepped closer, folding her hands in front of her. Her eyes, so practiced, so precise, didn't blink when she said, "A girl with no family has no place marrying into ours." I didn't move. I couldn't. It was like my ears rang and my body forgot how to respond to sound. I opened my mouth, but no words came. She continued, as if explaining a simple equation. "It's not personal, it's about legacy, about fit. A tree with no roots doesn't grow in a garden like ours." I felt my pulse in my teeth. Everything around me, the soft ivory room, the dimmed sconces, the silk robe draped over the chair, blurred into static. I don't know how long I stood there. But suddenly, from the doorway, a voice cut through it all. "That's enough, Michael." His voice was low and sharp, but it cracked with rage underneath. Margaret froze. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a calm that scared me more than yelling ever could. "I heard every word," he said. And I need you to hear this. The only person embarrassing our family is you." Her lips parted. "Michael." "No," he held up a hand. "You do not get to speak to the woman I love like that. Not now, not ever." I blinked hard. I hadn't even realized I was crying. Michael turned to me, voice softening. "You don't have to stand here and take this. You never have to earn their love, not when mine is already yours without conditions." I tried to breathe, but my chest shook. Years of trying to be the right shape for people. Years of hearing what I wasn't, not refined enough, not connected enough, not born into the right world. All of it broke, and I let it. The tears came fast, hot, cleansing. I covered my face with my hands as sobs cracked open everything I'd been holding in. The ache, the fight, the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, I could belong. Michael wrapped his arms around me and pulled me into him. "I've got you," he whispered. "I've always got you." Margaret said nothing, not a single word. She left the room quietly, heels clicking against the marble floor like punctuation. When she was gone, I pulled back just enough to look up at him. "I'm sorry," I choked out. "For what?" "For not saying anything, for letting her." "Hey," he said, brushing my tears away. "You don't owe anyone an explanation, especially not someone who can't see the miracle that is you." I rested my forehead against his chest. The wedding was tomorrow, and the woman who was supposed to welcome me had just tried to erase me instead. But Michael had chosen me, loudly, publicly, without hesitation. And for the first time in my life, I knew what it meant to be claimed. The morning of our wedding, the sky over Philadelphia was silver and still. No wind, no sun, just a quiet hush, like even the weather didn't want to interrupt. I stood by the window of the bridal suite, wearing a white robe that felt heavier than it should. My dress, simple, off the shoulder, stitched with tiny hand-sewn pearls, hung on the door like a promise I wasn't sure the world would let me keep. I hadn't slept much. After Margaret's words the night before, sleep had felt too fragile. But strangely, I didn't feel broken anymore. I felt awake. Michael had held me for hours, whispering things I never thought I'd hear, telling me I was enough, that he'd choose me every day, no matter who tried to rewrite the rules. And somehow those words had settled inside me, not like armor, but like a seed, something ready to grow. At 10 a.m., the makeup artist arrived. She smiled when I told her I'd be doing most of it myself. "You sure?" she asked. I nodded. "I've been preparing for this day a long time." What I didn't say was, I've been preparing for this since I was 11. Since the day I sat in a social worker's office and promised myself I'd never be helpless again. At noon, I slipped into my dress. My hands didn't shake. The small bridal party Michael and I had assembled, two of my classmates, one of his cousins who'd taken my side since the beginning, oohed and gasped as I stepped into the room fully dressed. But when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a princess. I saw a survivor. And maybe, for the first time, I saw a bride who didn't owe anyone an apology for how she got here. The ceremony was held in the garden of the historic venue we'd finally settled on, a compromised space Michael found when Margaret stopped responding to our final 3 suggestions. Stone pathways, hanging ivy, and old brick columns wrapped in soft white drapes. It was beautiful. And mine. I stood beneath the archway, facing Michael as he reached for my hands, his eyes steady. In the crowd, I caught glimpses of people I'd barely met. A few faces I knew. Several I didn't. Margaret was there. Front row, beside her husband, her face a study in stone. She didn't smile, she didn't cry. She just watched, expression unreadable, hands folded tightly in her lap. But I didn't focus on her. I focused on the way Michael's voice cracked slightly when he said my name. The way his vows wove in everything we'd fought through. Late nights, paper cranes, the weight of 2 very different worlds pressing in from both sides. "I don't want a life where we fit expectations," he said. "I want one where we fit each other." I barely made it through mine. We kissed. And for one moment, one perfect, golden second, it all fell away. The judgment, the past, the noise, we were just 2 people who'd chosen each other. The reception was sweet and simple. Toasts from friends, tears, laughter, dancing under fairy lights. I didn't speak to Margaret. She didn't approach me. And that was okay. Because by the time the music faded and the cake was cut and the last guest had wandered off into the soft night air, I knew something with certainty. I had done this. We had done this. Not with their approval, but with our truth. Later that week, Michael and I packed up the last of our boxes. We decided months ago that after the wedding, we were leaving Pennsylvania. Not for a honeymoon, there wasn't money for that yet, but for something bigger. A new beginning. New York City wasn't glamorous for us. It was loud, cramped, and full of corners where rent was just barely survivable. But it was ours. We moved into a small loft in Brooklyn. Exposed pipes, brick walls, a mattress on the floor, 2 chairs, one mismatched table we found on the sidewalk, and peace. Michael cut off most communication with his parents after the wedding. There were no dramatic declarations, just distance. The kind that says, if you want to find me, you'll need to walk toward the truth, not away from it. We built a new rhythm, breakfasts at the window ledge, late-night walks when the city cooled, holding hands beneath the subway lights like we were still discovering each other. One evening, while we were watching old sitcom reruns on the couch we'd saved up for, I turned to him. Do you regret any of it? He didn't even look away from the screen. Only that I didn't meet you sooner. I smiled. Even with everything that came with me? He looked at me then, really looked. Especially with everything that came with you. Because he knew, my past wasn't baggage, it was bricks. Bricks I'd stacked, one by one, to build a foundation no one could knock over. It had been 3 months since the wedding. By then, Michael and I had settled into something that felt dangerously close to peace. Not luxury, not ease, but peace. In our tiny Brooklyn loft, we had just enough space for 2 mugs, 2 chairs, and 2 people who still kissed good morning even when the coffee ran out. We didn't talk about his family much, not because it hurt, but because we'd given ourselves permission to move forward. Then one quiet Tuesday, the past found us anyway. It started with a knock, not the impatient tap-tap of a neighbor or the buzz of a delivery. It was deliberate, hesitant. Michael opened the door and froze. Dad. Charles Rowan stood there in a tailored coat that didn't belong to this part of town. His salt and pepper hair was windswept, his eyes tired in a way I hadn't seen before. He looked older, smaller even, or maybe it was just the setting, an uptown man trying to breathe in a downtown world. May I come in? He asked, voice low. Michael hesitated, then stepped aside. I stood by the small window, unsure whether to stay or flee. But this was my home too, and my life. And my name now sat beside Michael's on the mailbox downstairs, so I nodded politely and gestured to the single chair. We don't have a formal living room, I said, but you're welcome to sit. Charles gave a faint smile and took the seat. Michael leaned against the wall, arms crossed, waiting. I won't stay long, Charles began. I wasn't sure I'd come at all, but things have changed. I glanced at Michael, who gave nothing away. Charles looked at me. You may not believe this, Emily, but I always admired you, even when Margaret didn't behave well. I said nothing. Admiration without action is just decoration, he sighed. After the wedding, there was a silence in our house I've never felt before, not even after my father died. It was like your absence echoed louder than your presence ever could. I sat down slowly. Charles reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope. He held it loosely, not offering it, just holding it like it had weight. Margaret and I have been married 40 years, he said, and in that time I thought I knew everything about her. He looked up. But I didn't know she was an orphan too. My breath caught, Michael's brow furrowed. What? Charles nodded slowly. She changed her name in college, buried everything, even told people her parents had died in a skiing accident. But the truth, she was raised in foster care outside Trenton, a ward of the state until she was 18. Silence bloomed between us like smoke. She never told me, he continued. Not until after the wedding, we were fighting again, and I said something about legacy, and she screamed, "You think I had any legacy? I was just like her." He looked at me, then back at Michael. She meant you, Emily. I swallowed hard. She covered it up, Charles said. For decades, built a life around distance, around control, because she thought if she let anyone close enough to see the cracks, the whole thing would fall apart. He passed me the envelope. Inside were 2 faded black and white photos. A little girl, maybe 8, in oversized shoes standing in front of a government building. A scanned document, state file, no siblings, no next of kin. I held it with shaking fingers. Michael sat down slowly across from me. She hated you, Charles said quietly, not because of who you are, but because you reminded her of everything she tried to forget. It felt like the world shifted sideways. I remembered her face in that bridal suite. Cold. Measured. The way her voice didn't tremble when she told me I didn't belong. She wasn't protecting tradition. She was protecting a secret, a mirror she didn't want to look into. She didn't come here herself because she doesn't know how, Charles added. She's lived a lifetime pretending that part of her never existed. To face you now would be too honest. Michael leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Why tell us this now? Charles hesitated. Because I want to be a part of your life. If you'll let me. And because I think deep down Margaret regrets everything, even if she doesn't know how to say it. I nodded slowly, not because I forgave her, but because something clicked. Margaret hadn't just judged me. She'd judged a version of herself she'd worked her whole life to erase. The girl with no one. The girl who learned too early that survival meant silence, and success meant pretending the wounds were gone. And then I came along, a breathing reminder that healing doesn't mean hiding. That love, real love, demands truth. Charles stood. Thank you for listening. He reached into his coat again and pulled out a small box, plain, no ribbon. She asked me to give you this, he said, placing it on the table. Inside was a silver locket. Worn, simple, not Rowan wealth, elegant, older. The kind a child might be given by a foster parent who hoped she'd remember them. Inside, 2 tiny initials were carved in cursive. Emmy Margaret Elaine. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just held it. For both of us. Philadelphia looked different this time. It wasn't the skyline or the cobblestone sidewalks near the Rowan estate. It was the air, thicker, loaded, like it remembered. I held Michael's hand as we stepped through the front gates of his parents' mansion. For once, he didn't let go. Charles had called the meeting. Not a dinner, not a brunch, a meeting. As if naming it plainly would strip the layers away. Margaret was already seated in the parlor when we entered. She wore a muted navy dress and her usual strand of pearls, but her posture had softened. Shoulders not quite as square, eyes not quite as sharp. The locket wasn't around her neck. Charles gestured for us to sit. I took the chair opposite Margaret. No champagne, no appetizers, just silence, thick and awkward, as if every word was afraid to be the first. Michael broke it. We came because Dad said you had something to say. Margaret looked at him, then at me. I didn't call this meeting, she said carefully, but I'm not here to run. I stayed quiet, watching. Emily, she continued, you have every right to hate me. Still, I didn't respond, because I didn't, not anymore. Hate implies power. What I felt now was deeper, sadder. A kind of understanding that comes after too many winters, she sighed. I built a life out of distance, out of rules. I used etiquette like a fortress and perfection like armor. Michael crossed his arms, still tense. You used all that to decide Emily wasn't worthy. Her jaw clenched. No, I used it to protect what I thought I'd earned, a family name, a legacy. I spent years hiding where I came from, terrified someone would trace it back. I finally spoke. My voice was soft but steady. And then I walked in, and you saw the version of yourself you swore you'd never be again. Margaret flinched, just barely. Yes, she whispered. Charles cleared his throat. Margaret told me about her past after the wedding. She's been unraveling ever since. And honestly, so have I. Margaret looked down at her lap. I've been angry with you, Emily, not because of who you are, but because you made me feel everything I spent years numbing. I nodded slowly. You saw survival and couldn't bear its reflection. A beat passed, then another. Michael leaned forward. You should have told me about your childhood, about all of it. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. I was ashamed of being an orphan. Asked, not accusing, just asking. She hesitated. No, of abandoning her. Her voice broke on that last word. I left behind a scared little girl and built a woman the world would respect. I thought that was victory. She looked at me fully then. For the first time, really looked. But when you came along, when I saw your grace, your dignity, I realized I hadn't succeeded. I just buried the best parts of myself. Michael softened beside me. I don't expect forgiveness, she added. I swallowed the lump forming in my throat. And I don't offer it yet, I said gently. But I'm here and I'm listening. Margaret nodded once slowly. That's more than I deserve. We sat in stillness, honest, aching stillness. Then Michael reached into his jacket and handed Margaret a folded envelope. What's this? She asked. A sonogram, he said. She stared at it like it might burn her fingers. I'm pregnant, I said. Her eyes darted to me, then down at the paper. She opened it with trembling hands. There it was, a blurry black and white image of the life growing inside me. A heartbeat, a future. Her lip quivered. Charles placed a hand on her shoulder. Margaret closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, tears rimmed the edges. I don't want to be the reason my grandchild doesn't know where she came from, she said, voice cracking. I want to try. I want to be part of it, even if I have to start from scratch. I looked at Michael. He nodded, eyes shining. Then I turned back to her. You won't be perfect, I said. You'll get it wrong, but if you show up with honesty, we'll meet you there. She reached across the space between us tentatively and rested her hand over mine. It was small, fragile, but it was something. The moment Margaret's fingers touched the sonogram, something cracked. It wasn't loud or dramatic. There was no gasp or sob, just the slow unraveling of years she'd bound tight around herself like ivy choking a wall. I stared at the image as if it held the blueprint to redemption. "My first thought," she whispered, "was how will she look?" Her voice trembled, and I realized for the first time how rarely she let herself shake. "Will she have your eyes?" she asked softly, glancing up at me. "Or Michael's jaw?" She didn't wait for an answer. She couldn't. The words were spilling now, and once they began, they poured like a dam that had waited too long to break. I spent my entire life pretending I didn't come from shadows. I married Charles because he offered light, safety, structure. And when I met his world, the dinners, the fundraisers, the endless glasses of wine with polished women who never asked hard questions, I told myself that becoming one of them was survival. Her voice cracked. But I wasn't surviving, I was hiding. Michael leaned forward but didn't interrupt. This wasn't a confession, it was a reckoning. Margaret looked down at her lap, hands wringing the silk of her dress. "When I saw you, Emily, you reminded me of a girl I'd abandoned, not literally, but emotionally. The girl who cried herself to sleep in a shared foster room, who clung to kindness like it might evaporate, who memorized names of classmates with mothers who baked just so she could pretend." Her chin lifted and her eyes met mine. "You walked into my home with strength I'd spent decades trying to smother in myself, and I hated you for it." I swallowed hard. "You didn't deserve that," she said. "No one does." Silence, thick, raw, then I spoke. "When I was 11, after my parents died, I remember sitting in a social worker's office. She asked if I had anyone, an aunt, a friend, a neighbor, someone who could take me." I paused. "I said no." Margaret nodded, eyes shimmering. "I told myself that day I'd never need anyone, that I'd grow strong enough, smart enough, capable enough to never be at someone's mercy again." I held her gaze. "And then I met Michael. And suddenly I didn't want to be alone anymore. But walking into your world, it brought back every room I'd ever walked into where people measured me before they listened." Margaret's tears slipped freely now. "And then you told me a girl with no family had no place marrying into yours." She flinched. "But now," I said, reaching into my bag, "you're going to be part of this child's family. Whether you earn that place is up to you." I pulled out a small photo, a more recent sonogram. "This is her hand," I said softly, pointing. "Already flexing like she's making a fist." Margaret laughed through a sob. "Stubborn already." Michael placed a hand on my back. "Her name will be Ava," he said gently. Margaret's lip quivered. "I want to know her," she whispered. "I want to read her stories, brush her hair, hold her when she cries." Her voice dropped to a tremble. "I don't want to miss her life the way I missed mine." Charles moved to stand behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder. She clutched it like an anchor. "I can't erase what I said, but I can show you, both of you, who I want to become." I nodded carefully. "You'll need to start small," I said. "This family won't be built on grand gestures, just consistency." "I understand." We all stood in a kind of sacred quiet, no one rushing the moment. Then something unexpected happened. Margaret crossed the room and kneeled in front of me. Not dramatically, not for show, just a woman asking permission to begin again. Her hand moved gently toward my belly. "Hello, Ava," she whispered. "You don't know me yet, but I promise I will know you, every laugh, every tear, every milestone. If your parents let me, I will earn a place in your story." I couldn't hold the tears anymore. I placed my hand over hers, both resting over the small curve of my stomach. Michael crouched beside us. And there, in the center of a room once heavy with silence and judgment, something else bloomed. Hope. The kitchen smelled like roasted rosemary and garlic, with a faint trail of sugar from the lemon bars cooling on the counter. Michael was chopping onions, humming a Christmas tune despite the fact that it was late October. I stood at the sink rinsing lettuce, half listening, half smiling. Through the open doorway, I could hear Margaret reading Goodnight Moon for what had to be the 100th time. "Ava," she said softly, "we can't skip the red balloons, sweetheart. It's the best part." A tiny giggle followed. I dried my hands on a dish towel and peeked around the corner. There they were, my daughter, 3 and wild with curls, and the woman who once told me I didn't belong, now sitting crisscrossed on the nursery rug, her voice warm and gentle. Margaret had taken to bedtime stories like it was a mission. She started small, just short visits, a few hours here and there. But over time, something shifted. She began to stay longer. Then she started calling, just to ask about Ava's favorite snacks or how her nap schedule had changed. Now she came by every Wednesday and Friday to read stories, fold tiny socks, and brush Ava's hair with the kind of care that only comes from loss you refuse to repeat. Michael placed a kiss on my temple. "They're on the fourth round," he whispered. "I heard," I said, smiling. I turned back to watch. Margaret's pearl necklace caught the glow of the nightlight. She was barefoot, something she never would have allowed herself in the Rowan mansion, and her manicured hands moved gently over the pages, pausing so Ava could point and whisper, "Bunny." The sound of it, those two lives in sync, was something I didn't know how much I needed. Once this room was supposed to be a guest bedroom. Now it was filled with pastel stars, pillow forts, and second chances. "Again," Ava said sleepily. "All right," Margaret whispered, "but just one more time." She started the story over, and this time Ava leaned into her without hesitation. Margaret didn't flinch. She wrapped an arm around the small body and pulled her close. I watched her lips move, slow and careful, as if reciting a prayer she'd once forgot how to believe in. I walked back to the kitchen, blinking away the sting behind my eyes. "She's changed," I said quietly. Michael nodded. "I think she always wanted to. She just didn't know how until now." The clink of the knife hitting the cutting board was the only sound for a moment. Then he added, "She calls off her second first chance." I smiled, heart tightening. The woman who'd once weaponized silence now read books with the patience of someone making up for every bedtime she'd never been read to. Ava didn't know any of that yet. She didn't know about locket secrets, or orphanage files, or cold dinners filled with veiled disapproval. She just knew that every time Margaret came over, she brought silly voices, pink barrettes, and apple slices cut into stars. She just knew love. And that more than any redemption arc, more than any confession, was the proof of how far we'd come. Later that night, after the dishes were done and Margaret had left with a soft "good night," my girls, Michael and I sat together on the couch. He held my hand, the same way he had in that courthouse apartment years ago, the same way he did when the florist ignored my budget, the same way he did when his mother once told me I didn't belong. And now here we were, a family, not a perfect one. Not one without jagged roots or stitched-up wounds, but real. The kind that grows not from name or status, but from choice. From every no that led us to a better yes. From every cracked open heart that let the light in. From the little girl I once was to the woman I now am. Loved, seen, finally home. If you've followed Emily's journey all the way to this moment, thank you. Drop a comment if you believe home isn't where you're born, it's where you're chosen. And hit like if you know that the family we build can sometimes heal the family we lost.